Niba gunle namdol shing yende gunge gemba bo semje gunge nye jigun tamje kenla gunjanze Women jogi ingen podan dusum sange gunge ngowo ni semjugo ngosumandan zembe Save lame shabla so wide Tambichu Nyamsulembe Kulun Sangbo Nijungi Sambatang Jachubki Semtan Tembe Koni Tambichu Sembarishu
So, firstly, in the context of practicing the profound, sublime Dharma, we need to cultivate a positive motivation. Within the context of practice, that positive motivation entails renunciation and the mind of supreme awakening. So, with that mind being cultivated, please listen to the teachings that follow.
Lam Tabdan Sherab ni penane Sherab ke lam Dame Topa Tini Tini Rangula Kebe Chetula Ribe Kone Dame Pati Tenla Papugare Tenla Papati Tini Susu Simla Charni Susu Dagdun Zinshabati Maybe Nisuldan Tungudu Tungumindu Usani Tayetela Tini Dame Jekum Jeba Sani Sugare Tanganzu Tanda De Shubikabre.
As for the path that we're supposed to take in the context of practicing the Dharma, there are two factors. There's the factor of method or strategy, and then the factor of wisdom or intellect, we could say. In this context, we're talking about this path of wisdom, this path of intelligence. And what that entails is the realization or recognition of the absence of a self. So the goal is to awaken that realization, to bring about that recognition within our own minds. And a way that we can do that is through the application of rationality, reasoning. And so the goal of that type of analysis is to come to ascertain, come to certainty, come to decide matter-of-factly that there is no self. And we need, and with that, again, what does that entail? That entails taking that into a question and comparing that with reality. Does, for example, clinging to a self, is that in harmony with the way things truly are, or is that not in harmony with the way things are? Is the fact of selflessness in tune with reality, or is it not in tune with reality? And what is this? What do we call this? This is called analytical meditation, or a familiarization with that fact based on analysis or investigation. And so that's the context that we're talking about today.
nachidang tesam komsum ki nang ta chegum je yongdu zowdi ngaranso samjung gi shirabdi zo nyamne chigere disedu tebe kapsula dame gi kor gowa lepte bachore tadi gowa di de tsam ki tengdo masha bacheni ani chebacheni uni redu maredu sani susu ki pungboda ngala pa shibni tayongdu ani sem ki tengdo tozo ji teba chebe kapsula jungsha bika gowa di kale latini nyongwe ngowala gyutu gore tortina chegum kita ngowo daw chigdi gowa di nyongwala gyure tang derimba shilo tini gomdi yakbo chini ta nyurungbu gomyongdo tini tama dela nyongwa din tokbe ngowala gyutu gore ta dinani zogo di chegum se di nyongwa tang dewa shukchung bachire.
In general, we can talk about this path within the factors of, we could call it studying. First would be study, then is contemplation, reflection maybe, and then is meditation or familiarization. So study, reflection, and meditation. Among these three, well, in general, we're talking about this analytical meditation, right? And how can we approach that? We can approach that through these three steps. These three steps on the path. So when it comes to this analytical meditation, we can frame that within the idea of the wisdom or the intelligence that comes about through contemplation. Again, so what do we mean by that? First, we're listening to the teachings. We get an intellectual understanding, a conceptual understanding of what we mean by this idea of selflessness. But it's only a conceptual or intellectual understanding. We kind of know the ins and outs. But we can't just stop there. We need to go into the next step. That next step is, in this context, we're talking about this analysis, the investigation, really getting to know what this means. Is this correct, what we listen to in the teachings, or is it not correct? Is it true or is it not true that this idea of self is connected to the aggregates, my 5 aggregates, what I call myself? What is the relationship between those two things? We're really looking at things and we're really kind of coming to grips with what this means. And so we're using this understanding that we got from study. And slowly, we're starting to really reflect and contemplate and mull it over. And what happens is, this is going from an intellectual understanding to an experience. You're really feeling what these teachings are trying to get at. It's an experiential experience that we're having when we're doing this analytical meditation. And so that's what this is what makes analytical meditation. It has this factor, this sense of experience that comes with it. And so step by step, as we go through the meditations, step by step, day by day, as we do this, after a long while, and it takes a while, then eventually we'll come to realization. First it was just an understanding, then it was an experience, but after a while, a long time perhaps maybe, we come to the essence of what this understanding, or what this realization is of selflessness. So right now, however, we're talking about this experiential factor of analytical meditation.
나서 당한주 가서 봐봐 검단디 직두절게 릭바당 찬니 검단데 슈베카브레 다델라 카상 네 시당 템베코니 냠슬랭고 그래 송바레 다네 시긴낭네 각장에 받네당 캬방에 받네디 다 가상 아주 슈바레.
So, when it comes to how to go about doing this meditation, we're doing it through this reasoning of one or many, same or difference, and the fact that the self lacks the nature of being similar or different, one or many, however you like to think about it. And in our previous teachings, we gave kind of a layout of how this is going to work through these 4 certainties that we need to prepare ourselves with, and then to proceed in this meditation. The first 2 are the gaining a certainty on what it is that we're refuting, and the second one is gaining or having a certainty of what the logical rules are, what are the logical guidelines that we need to maintain when we're going about this analytical meditation.
다 가정에 봐 세디 돈다 도도시나 ngaransu ngarjindege ngaseti 풍부라 때네 딱샤와 잠식 마인발 오니다 랑죽수 줍데바지 예스니 생겨요래 덴데기 되니 진낭 게 율기 신율기 nga 딱자 마인바 아주 technical term 배주당 바에나 랑갸투 바당 제수투 바세요 봐 당아주 고대와 지는다 그래 원내세다 드랑래 real 스나미도 actual 지어와 어디에더니 짐바나 신기 딘데도 메도 스네디 하고에 따에들라다 딜랑은 가자 세요와.
So, to give a brief review on what do we mean by the object of our refutation, what is it that we mean by this is the thing that we need to refute, we need to see as not truly existent. It comes down to so we have this sense of self, and we cling to this sense of I. So it's this sense of I that is what we're talking about when we talk about the thing to refute. And how do we relate to this sense of I? It's by its relationship on the 5 aggregates. It's an imputation that is based on or put onto or projected onto these 5 aggregates. And that's what it is. It's a mere label. It's a mere imputation. It's a projection of our minds. So, but the way that we relate to it is that it's really there. That it's somehow it's independent. It's self-sustaining or self-sufficient, we could say. So this is how we relate to it, or we cling to it, or we grasp onto it. This is the object. This is the object of attachment that we're talking about, and all it comes down to is this mere imputation. But that's after analysis. Now, currently, the way that we relate to it is that it's actually real, that it's actual, some more kind of philosophical terms, that it's substantial, that it holds weight, right? That is it's independent, it's self-sufficient. These are the kind of ideas that we attach to this idea of me, myself, I. And so that's how we need to look at it. Okay, is the way that we think it exists, meaning the way that we attach to it, the way that we cling to it, is that really true? Does it exist in the way that we cling to it? So that's the goal of the analysis. And it's that which we're trying to refute.
Tadeyang kodewajena ngazu ngasedi dengi tengdula zuma imba kanshila ngarjing jinyongdu ngone du jinyongore ondadi dine jeba telatini ngarjing yuldu kyurbeke nga zumala ngone in samkengi ngone seshtuwa ondelatini kasubabeke kakchas labare.
This I, this clinging, or this sense of I, the way that we think of it is that it's actually there, but in reality it's fake. It's not really true. It's a mere imputation, but we still cling to it as something that is actually present before us, present within us, you could say. And so that's where we need to investigate this. Is this true or not? Is this object, is this thing that we call ourselves, that this object, this grasped object of ego clinging, is it really true? And so again, we can come to what do we mean by this thing that we need to refute? It's the thing that you really think is you. The thing that you really think is yourself.
Ta nipa kyabangeba sedi ngaso taje tangtangki tablam dawati tini tim dawadala sigore kisi nga sedi ngune ki yona ta yusul di tini kandichi koni yokoto sini dela taje tangbare ta di tini dakshi phungbo dang yana chigi suldu yokogore yana dedang tadebi suldu yokogore tini deni mayimbeki yuluk sumbaji mindu sinida ta che songbatela ani kyapangye ba songbare.
The second factor is this certainty on the logical or the rational means of going about investigating this sense of self. So it's essentially how do we go about it? What are the guidelines? What are the limits of what we can and cannot do? What's going to aid us? What's going to be the method or the strategy that we go about of deciding whether or not there is or is not a self? And so it can be simply this kind of rational idea. Okay, so if I exist, I have to exist in some kind of way. There has to be a certain kind of way in which that I am here, that I'm real. And so when we come to try to figure out and set our limits of how this is, and we can do it in many ways, but in this context, where we're relating, okay, so the self, if it does exist, it has to relate somehow to the aggregates. And so really we only have two options. It's either this self that I'm clinging to is identical in nature to the five aggregates, or it's somehow different. It's essentially different or essentially separated somehow from the five aggregates. And then then we can really come down to is that the only way that things can exist, right? Is it being same or different, singular or multiple? So figuring out or coming to a decision that there's no other option. If something is real, it has to be either singular or plural, and the fact that there's no other third option possible, that's what we mean by coming to terms or coming to certainty about what we mean by what are the guidelines, what are the rules that we have to apply to when we're trying to decide whether or not this self is truly real or not truly real.
Tadi karirasana ngazu cheba jedu cheba dile timju korwa an tim mena cheba de katu inaya takyol tugu mare tadi pening jeba shayare pena da ngazu khangba chigin nangla michi chaga dugo na 강바디 나라 카미 니 여바이나 다 당보 강바디 나라 미리 여나 메나사메 가난줄라 태좀 여와 독바여레 다 덴데긴 독바디 세바제발라 당보 강바디 나라 카미 가주도 세딩 아주 하고 와지고도와 다 카미 마뇽 하마거나 강바 나라 친다 친바인 이내양 드니 니마송 삼바지마도 타지도 민두스네 타주에 가고요래 봐. 다 강베데 나라 카미 니마도 메바 타주 용도 강베 당보 나라 때 많이 니바 나라 때네 많이 용도 다 람상 셈라 가리래 다 갸차갸 미디 강바데 나라 민두 가르레스나 게시 여나 강바니 강롱 지나라 요거바 간실라 니가라 나랑게 때는 체 니마송 제산 갸적갸 민두세 타초이 투구도와 다디마도 강바들라 짠니 장가다오지 메 타메바이나 때니 셴바지 요스바레세디 갸적갸 강바데나라 미디 민두 산베게 니시케기 말라 독바데 세 투구입니다 어다다나 캬방에 봐세 데니질라 순거요래
So, what do we mean by these rules or guidelines for investigation? Well, we can easily say that if we don't have any guidelines or rules for investigating, then we're not going to be able to come to any kind of certainty about what we're talking about. If we don't have some kind of platform or some kind of way of going about talking about these things. So a good example of what do we mean by this is, say there's a house and you're trying to find somebody in that house. And that house only has 2 rooms in it. Only 2 rooms. And you know that. You know there's only 2 rooms. But you still don't know, okay, are they in the house or are they not in the house? So in order to clear away this doubt of whether they're there or not, you need to first you really need to know what are the possibilities. What are the possibilities of them being in that house or not? And so you know that there's only 2 rooms. So you can logically assume that they're going to be in either one of those 2 rooms. So you have that settled. All right, if they're there, they have to be in either one or the other rooms. So you go into the house and you look into the first room. And you see if they're there or not. Say if they're not there. So you have to assume, okay, if they're not in the second room, they're not in the house at all. So you go investigate into the second room, you find that they're not there. So doing that investigation and having those limits of possibility, we could probably say, those limits of possibility are only one of 2 options. They have to be either in the first room or the second room. If they're in neither of those rooms, then you can rationally prove that they're not there. And so But if you don't know how many rooms are there, if you don't know how big the house is, if you don't know, if there's a lot of factors that are left uncertain, then you can't come to any kind of certainty of whether or not they're there in that house or not. And so in order to gain that certainty, you have to know your limits of possibility. Without that, you're not going to be able to get rid of your doubt.
Tadi neka chumbujire chine nga chu komdi le la bo yere la ni ne tame di komdi shira intellectual chigyu yo mare ti so practical chigure ti sudi kari se gore sena ta nga se ngarang ge chonnang di ngarang ge subu dang ngarang ge semba ting su dang kare do sene tegar samlo tang gore ma do o da yang an chu kap ka la pe philosophy kaldo chaya chorwa penna o ta da se te pe mysterious shivures rwa yang anju di re mare khaya lap thu mare pe sa samlotang madan choyo mare sini nigyu yo mare sini se shege mare sol thu mare sini tende ge chi yongro ba anju ji injikela na mysterious segro ba ta ta na madana nigyu mare pendo yo mare tende samlo jungsong ba na tende dame gomna tha chue khabu yongre rwa tende mare and this is this practical chigore.
So an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about this meditation on the lack of a self is that when you're doing the meditation, it should be something practical. It shouldn't be something just kind of maybe an intellectual kind of musing. It shouldn't be left at that. And what do we mean by that? We have this feeling of the self. We can't deny it. And we can kind of mull over what it means to be me, to have a self, to be the I. But say if we kind of just keep it this kind of a heady kind of philosophical musing, it has no really practical. There's no practical engagement. It's useless if we just keep it at something of just kind of like a mysterious thing that we're thinking about. Okay, so what do I mean by that? For example, if you're thinking, okay, I have this feeling of the self, of me, but really, I mean, it's so abstract and ambiguous. I mean, it's there, but I can't really decide on whether or not it's not something to be found necessarily, but it doesn't mean that it's not real. It's not something that can be kind of pinned down or something like that. Therefore, there's really no use in talking about whether it exists or not, because it's just not something that can be done. So if we shirk off the this meditation as just being, or if we shirk off this idea of self as just some mysterious kind of abstract idea, then there's going to be no benefit to it. So really it comes down to, okay, this is a practical thing, and this is something that can be applied, and it's not just some kind of a heady kind of musing of philosophy.
당에디 가르치는 슈고스는 아주 디 단ang 아주 낭박의 딱세지 디 줍다게 줬다고 다도 여여명 아주 세계요 말아 디 너르교요 말해 낭백의 또도 있는 낭백은 아주 다나 담에 검색이 검액의 다디 ngaranzule yebeki lengi dila nga sedle seger mato ti hindu ke atma dia nga jo sege yo mare ba ani ji sole nga jo sege yo mare mato yang da soul dang atma sed shida ke mysterious thing nga jo samata mato khaya yo mare khashi yang teni mongbo samdo chung go ba tinga jo ta ge yo mare tanda nga jo nangbe gen da sedi nga seji ga genji du genji nyora so genji do wa 다 딜렀다게 여러봐. 언딩이 이와 체에 이렇게 좀 버려.
Why am I saying this? It's in the context of Buddhism, when we're talking about the self. It comes. So we're talking about the self in the context of the selflessness, right? And when we really get down to it, what do we mean by the self? It's just this natural, almost kind of, it's like a co-emergent idea of self. Just meaning it's this natural kind of automatic sense of me. And one we don't, and it's just it's we're leaving it kind of at that. That's what we're working with. We're not kind of saying, like the Hindu or the other, maybe Hindus would say the Atman, this great self. We're not hyping it up to that level of self, and we're not hyping it up to the idea of a soul or something like that. It's this basic sense of self, this basic thing that feels, that suffers, that becomes happy. It's this feeler, this experiencer. And that's what we're talking about. This is what we mean by the idea of self.
그래서 다디 니 간지 슈인스나디 캬방에 봤어야 되와 디양 하마거나 다세디 따제 땅 두고 말에 아니 삼로 그 미스테리스 시우스레스는 육샥 바이나 드네 양 아주 다면 거면 깔라고 용도 와 어떤데 말해.
So again, when we're coming to these guidelines of logic, what it means to come to certainty about something, we need to figure out what the limits of possibility are for this self. And so if we kind of shirk off the idea of self as just this mysterious thing that is not worth investigating, then we're never going to come to any kind of assertion of whether it exists or not, right? So we need to figure out what we mean by this self. Therefore, we can approach it. We can see if what we're relating to when we're talking about this basic sense of self, does it exist in the way that things can exist? So without that, we can't come to certainty whether it's there or not.
답에 신바제야 인지버려 아주 남주 다다디 출발와 매발라 여벌 진샤와래 디페디드니 다 가상 아주 망고 쉬버려 타다 줄진을 빼샤와 다 타과라 둘도 툴니 동안용용도 우주 갭니다 둘메스니 미좀 대바이네 시라팽 말에다 오니 나랑게 통샤과디 율디 둘레도 말도 따고 그러와 다다 용도 값을라 기시 둘디 여나 여당이 마도 여말에 그러와 나랑게 통샤에기 출신 탁바대당 양나 지기 줄도 연구거래 양나 탁바델레 타데비 줄도 요구도 와. 다 덴데기 둘디 출비기 율도 규비기 둘디 탁발라 직 줄도 양 매바지. 탁발레 타데비 줄도 매바지. 다 여당 순바지더니 여여 말라 게스 여바이나 나랑주기 줄들니단 대화가야미도 와고. 다 딜라더니 다지 네 강바베 쉬우다 딩이 더버더버래. 두 섬노당 바이나. 다 대나싱 아주 단다 다제 땅도 아니 봉보다 야나 지기술도 요고도 야나 타데비술도 요고도 스는 예바도 스키고 거래.
Another good example is to think about the example of someone mistaking a rope for a snake. And so we're essentially the meaning is, okay, the sense of self is a confused perception. What do we mean by that? We think that something exists when it doesn't exist at all. And so we can use this example of the snake and the rope. Someone sees what appears to be a snake in the middle of the road. And based on that perception of there being a snake, they have suffering, or they have fear. They feel something. There's a reaction. And say this, and just by closing your eyes and saying that the snake doesn't exist is not going to help. What the person needs to do is actually go investigate whether or not it's true that there's a snake or not, in order to come to a certainty of whether it's actually there. So how do they do that? What does it mean to go investigate if the snake is there or not? So you assume, okay, if the snake is actually there, it has to exist in either one of two ways. And so when you're doing this investigation, you're thinking, okay, is what I'm seeing here, is this snake, is it the same thing as this rope, or is it completely different from the rope? Because it can only exist in either two ways. And you investigate, okay, obviously the snake is not the same thing as the rope, and you know that this thing that you thought was a snake can't be anything other than the rope. This is also not true, because it doesn't exist, right? And then so the third option is something that it's both not the rope, and it's both not the same thing as the rope, and it's not completely different from the rope, meaning that there's no connection or something like that. So this option is ridiculous when it comes to how things should exist. And so it's the same thing as the house. If the person's there, it has to be either in the first room or the second room. If that's not what's happening, then they're not there. And same thing with the self. If the self exists, it has to either be identical to the five aggregates, or it has to be completely separate from the five aggregates. There's either only one. If it exists, it has to be one of either options. And so that's what we're coming to terms with what it means to exist or to be real. And it can only accord with these one of two limits of possibility.
So tatani diring ange tanganzo dijela da rikpangwe di yango yore. Da rikpangwe di dini dende ki dagdi phungbo dang chigi tsuldu dubayang maimba kanshikla dende kin dagdi phungbo le tadebi tsuldo yang duba mepa tenla phaba tela tini chig dutal kirikpa salabare ta sumba dang shiba yarwa rikpa ngone di chigi tsuldu duda mindu sene tache tanya di rikpa tangbore tini dile dumam tadebi tsuldu duda mindu se di rikpa nipa yarwa onda do seko gore.
So now when it comes to the actual reasonings of selflessness, we can say that the self, it does not exist, it's not established. It can't be said to be established as something which is identical to the five aggregates, one, and it can't be established as something that is other than the five aggregates. And so because it cannot be established as the same thing, and it cannot be established as something different, that is what we call the result of reasoning, of being free from singularity and multiplicity, or sameness and difference, right? So the first reasoning is lumped within the idea of, okay, the self cannot be is not established as being exactly the same as the five aggregates, and the second one is that the self cannot be established as different or separated from the five aggregates.
다 다 다디 다 단징에 빼쉬버나 신 아주 간데 다 당보 찌그래도 말해서 따지 당 거라와 다당 풍분이 부디 다 단징에 빼쉬버나 신 타라 루징에 뺄렸잖아 레라보여래 둘 매발라 툴네 둘 루징베 로게바디 가스바바가 닥진라와 다진디르 되니 대기 율도 겨르베기 된라 메신도 나와 둘디 가스바베겐 닥디르 와 닥디르 다되니 출사기 시제로 와. 디 아니 탁바데로 와. 탁바타르데. 디 가르레스나 되니 풍부디레스는 다들 최숨데 당과 하고도 와. 출레 출바기 셈직제. 되니 출바디게 율 직제. 되니 출사기 되니 시직제니. 다 딘조거 등아죠. 원해잖아. 나저저베기 슝도 나라더니 닝저버 베시 송어래. 룰디 가르레스나 군닥세 그래스. 탁바들라 가르세 그래스나 샤완세 그래스 라바레. 되니 탁바디 룰기 똥바 차들라 용접세 그래스. 근데 그 타니다 다된종에 나나 내가 가수바바다 말데 이내야한디 디 약보 하고 버지발라 나저저베기 슝든조 냐 아주 다음에 검도 나저저베기 슝나 또슬럽전 자야나 아니 베세브 차그래 출시당 출바당 출킨든 들어와 남주 마한생 아주 냠도 용도 이와치 도구면도 와 다 간다 돈다 도도나 당보 빼라 디숨이여바나시 디숨이여바디 세바하고 디레라도 와 디지잉에 버져거래
So again, a good example of what we mean by this first reasoning, of whether or not the self exists, given its a relationship of singularity with the aggregates. Again, we can come back to this idea of the snake and the rope, right? So it is the fact what is happening here is that there is a mind which clings to there being a snake when there's not a snake. So that's simple, right? And what is that? That relates to we cling to something that is not there, the self, when it's not there. We cling to something as being there when it's not truly there. So this is the idea of a confused or mistaken perception or confused and mistaken mind. Then the second factor is the object, okay? So even though there is no snake there, we cling to that snake, or it's that snake that we're clinging to. That's the object of our grasping, right? Even though it doesn't actually exist as an object in itself, it's perceived as being an object. And so we can say that's the same thing as the self. The self doesn't exist, but it's assumed to be an object in itself. And then there's the place that we impute something onto. It's the basis. What is the basis of our imputation? In the case of the snake and the rope, it's the rope, right? It's a mistaken mind that projects onto the rope as its basis, the presence of a snake. Same thing, we project onto the five aggregates this idea of self. And so we have these three factors. We have a mind, a mistaken mind. We have the mistaken object, or the object which we think is truly there but is not. And then we have the basis on which we make that imputation. Within Buddhism, there's the school of Yogacara, and they make this very, very clear, or they use this example a lot, and makes a lot of sense when we when we talk about this idea of selflessness in the context of Yogacara. They're really good at explaining this idea. There's the three modes, the three kind of three principles of reality that the Yogacaryans talk about. And we can again relate it back to this idea of the snake and the rope. For example, the snake is what we call this imputed reality. It's mere imputation. The rope itself is what we call, in Tibetan it's called shinwang. We can call it dependent, maybe dependent reality. And the fact that there is no snake inherent in that rope, that is what we call the thoroughly established nature. So it's these three factors that the Yogacaryans base all their philosophy on. And it's going through this idea of the three natures, they come to a very clear and an easy understanding, or for us, an easy way to understand this idea of selflessness. So again, there's this way of clinging we can talk about from the idea of this mind which clings, this mistaken mind. We have the mistaken object, and we have the basis, the basis of this mistaken perception. And by using these, we can come to a good understanding of what we mean by selflessness.
Tachidani ngazu kom yakbo jagotena naju chebeki shungde zula tos lobjon chana pe yakore ko main kona Yogacarya la bra ko gomgi ke jakare ne semna chana ke jigdwa kap la ngazu yang uma beja mangbo ta ti yul gyanya jarde ti semba to ji khareso gore disconnect 그소가 들렸어 봐요. 되네 락버도 당 아주 검갑스도 삼말라 가르치고 그래서나더니 소소기 심 undoing the 가르쳐 봐요. unhealthy knots of our habitual tendencies. 다 디기드니 셈기 지금 메커니즘 저와 툴당디 나주저벽에 빼 대시 림바시는 야부자 그래. 아주 음악바가 코페 격단에 띄서지 가보도와 음악바값을 사상 도다인 태강파라 도샤로와 디 왕고 라비나도 고축도사르데 지당에는 디 고메 가보도와 된나주저베 값을 림바 신도되니 나와 셈 동바 웨살 송주스네 베 칼레 진행 도유야고래 나와 셈 동바 웨살 송주세디 나서 다디 양 아주 더 검게 깨지시기 봐 송삼 다디 지 요가자라기 애버타이즈먼트 제바로 차송 공다시
So this way of talking about selflessness from the perspective of Yogacara is really helpful. And not just in the case of just selflessness, but if we're familiarizing ourselves with anything within the Buddhist context, this Yogacara way of thinking about it is really good. Therefore, I really encourage everyone to study it, to really read up on what this school of Yogacara is. Essentially, what they're really good at is this idea of familiarization, and applying it to the mind, really making it connect with our own minds when we're talking about philosophy. In contrast, we can probably say the Madhyamikins don't really do that so much, the middle way followers, and that they're really looking at objects, maybe objectivity we could say. So the difference would be subjectivity versus objectivity, but the Madhyamikins really harp on this idea of objects, and there can be a definite disconnect if you're only going about a Madhyamika approach, in that you're not connecting it to the mind, not connecting it to our own minds. So that's a possibility. And the point of meditation, familiarization within the Buddhist context, is to undo these unhealthy patterns or habitual tendencies that we've gathered, that we have this unhealthy psychology. And so this is really very beneficial to when it comes to, okay, how do we apply this to the nature or the understanding of our own minds. And again, right, so the Madhyamikas don't really do this. They want to go straight to this idea of that everything is completely free from all fabrication, or everything is complete simplicity. They want to go straight to the point. And that can be jarring. And in contrast to the way that the Yogacaryans go about it, they go about it step by step, really going through the process of coming to this realization. Meaning they go through the process, okay, appearances are mind. Mind is emptiness. And emptiness is, we say, luminosity. So all appearances are mind, mind is empty, and emptiness is luminosity or cognizance or clarity. And so this is a very meditation-focused approach to coming to understanding anything when it comes to meditation, but also in the context of selflessness. So I apologize for giving this short advertisement for Yogacara.
Tadi nganzo semkichik lega chitangsi mechanism cherba ti yakpo hako chebala ani najujebe shundisnala sebu sungudowa.
And again, and so it's the Yogacaryas, what they're good at is really coming to understand how the mind works, this mechanism of the mind. How does the mind work within the context of Yogacara?
Laso tadeni ngazu teach ta dangbo diteni da dang phumbu nyepudi teni ngochi redu maridu sini taidrwa dangbo di taire ta di sebe kapsula pena ngedanji pesha wana shin duljin ki tulni dul당 타반 예부디 직수 통용 거라와 따티 ngoyenesul redu maredu seneda samlatang 거래 타바단 두nyebudi 직redu maredu sene gesi 직이나 네바 가레가레 연구도 ngoyenesul당 가레가레 통금민도 세라고 그래.
So in this context of talking about selflessness, so what we do is that we impute onto, or we cling to the self, the sense of I, as being identical to the aggregates. And we need to investigate, okay, is this how it really is, or is this not true? The idea that the self is identical or the same as the five aggregates. In the same way, for example, someone clings to or misunderstands or misperceives or is confused and sees the snake or sees the rope as a snake, right? And what is happening in that instance is that they've made the idea of snake and the rope are essentially the same. They've come to mistake the rope and the snake as essentially the same. And so the investigation is to say, okay, is this really true? What does it mean? What does it imply? What are the consequences of saying that this incorrect perception of a snake and the rope are essentially the same. What does that imply?
Ta pena kisi dul de dang tul bekin dul de dang tawa nyebudi ngo chigi na rwa ngwe nisula segyorda ngwe nisula ko nyebudi kisi chigba chigyan ina teni dul la yebe ki keju ngo dinzu tawa de la dengu rwa takpa la ki keju ngo dinzu dul la dengu rwa ko nyi ngo chigba rwa ngwe nisula tende imba ina tadi yuhaimido wa takpa ki kejungo kagarela dul ki kejungo kagare dul di chiko sokten yimba nashin takpa yang sokten charu garela dul la chi dugdang da chi takdang shadang mangbo yoro wa konjingi yewa chigi meba charu garisandi ngoye nisuro wa kisi di ngoye nisu ina se gore koran niga ki kejudang ngowo dang jile dinzu pala yoba nashin chula yoba nashin pala yoba charu gore se bare pedirwa ta dedidine ngaranzo da datang phungbu la de jarni ani samatang ko gore.
So in the example, it's the mistaken the object which is confused as a snake, yeah? This confused object, which is the snake and the rope, if they are essentially the same, right? We're just kind of, if they're actually the same thing, yeah, then what does that imply? It implies that the characteristics of the snake have to be inherent in the rope, and vice versa. The inherent qualities, what makes the rope a rope, has to be essentially the same or inherent within the snake. Or we're talking about if they're actually essentially the very same things. And so is this possible? Of course not, right? The characteristics of a snake and the characteristics of a rope are completely the same. Completely different, right? For example, what are some characteristics of the snake? The snake is alive, right? It has life force. What is that? It has made of flesh and has bones and blood. And those are very, very different characteristics than those of a rope, correct? Right? So again, if the rope and the snake are essentially, completely the same thing, then they have to share the qualities, the essence, and the functionality of each other at the same time, if it is true that they're actually the same. And so now we can apply this to the self and the five aggregates.
Tadini pedina shinda ngazu kande chago resena kesi dagdang dagdi phungbu dang chigi tsuldu duba di ngoye nisu inas rwa ngoye nisu inas ani pena dangi kesi thakpa di duli na kyun mangbo chungu rwa ripin nepa mangbo chungu rwa den na shinchini kesi phungbu de teni phungbu dang dadi chigba yinsongwa inas ta phungbu di dumayor ba phungbu di dumayor chigmar ba ta chedang anzu phungbu nga lapcho gere ina ta na de go dewa chen ni le shana de gere phungbu nga se de sibu dang sem ni la sha shana go dewa yore dame komdi phungbu suk phungbu se de khana chig chig ba ani shemba sem da chorba dushi chasang de sem se nang de ta gandar phungbu se di dumerang shinjira ba ngoye ne sulla tadi gechi jo chik di karre tak se di jin yong du da ge jindang di da jin de da jin yong de kapsula da de kar dume jingir ba ngazu jing mar ba nga chi ye samgad ma do nga mangbo ye nga ni ye nga ye sene de nga samba san ko mare 제산 견직 되는 용어도 와 맞아 다 강달 진당 대당 율니 퉁고요 말에 다디 투시에서는 딜세요 와 둘긴 출긴 되게 둘 레삼바르데 율리 둘 말에 와 띵이 퉁고요 말아 와 어디 나신지네 따가래 다디 풍부디 지긴송와이나 풍부 다 최 망보지로 와그 두마나 신진지래 아니 다기 진용들이 두마 증 말에 찍 증용 거라 와 nga 찍이 nga디 찍인 사람 딩이 디금도 와 견직 되는 거라 다 내가 나신게 가래 풍부디 미닥 바란시로 와 깨직라 귤두거라 가두거라 롱에마당 로단닥네 풍부들라 기로망고시라 탭사래데 다 남주 안주 진단게 다게 율데 가래 nga 찍바인 깨베 nga디 nga라인 삼바지마도 nga 미닥바란 신진 있으면 아주 증기가 말아 다 제사 기시 풍부된 다이나 되게 말아 가르에서나 다징의 율단딩 일단 퉁금이도 와 뭐에니수다 퉁금이요 말아요 다디 가르세부에서나 기시 둘디 탁바디 둘이나 리베그네바 망보 여바 송자 탁바디 둘 마레스니와 니시께 거바나 신진이 기시 풍부다 다들 찍이나 견데데니 이거서 진당다 퉁금해봐 송자 띵어에 내서도 퉁금도 제자 아니 풍부 당다디 찍되 샤토금민도 세들라 와 탁바단 둘니 찍도 샤마도 니시께데 딱 가서 밥에 가래 곰단 찍디래
So how do we approach this when it comes to the idea when it comes to the aggregates and the self? So if the aggregates and the self are essentially the same thing, right? We're saying that they're actually the same thing. If it is possible that they're actually the same thing, what does it mean? What does it imply? What are the consequences of that idea? So, for example, there were a lot of rational inconsistencies and problems with the idea to think that a rope and a snake can be essentially the same thing, right? So it follows the same thing with the self and the aggregates. If they are truly the same, there's a lot of problems that come about. For example, we say the aggregates, right? There are many aggregates. They're essentially, or their nature is to be multiple. This idea of even the word aggregate, right? It's not that the aggregate is just one single thing. When we can talk about the 5 aggregates, of course, we can also talk about, in this context, it's probably easier to say that the 2 aggregates, the aggregate of form and the aggregate of mind. Within the aggregate of mind, we have feeling, perception, etc., right? So it's a multiple. It's when we talk about the aggregates, it's many things. It's many things coming together. So because the aggregates are essential or naturally a collection of many things, that contradicts the way that we cling or that we perceive the self. Isn't that true? Right? For example, we perceive the self not to be many things, right? We perceive the self as something that is essentially singular, as one thing, right? Myself, me. We see it as something that is one, right? And if it was true that the self and the 5 or the aggregates are the same, then that would imply that there have to be many or multiple me's. Where there's 2 kinds of me's or there are 5 kinds of me's. But we don't cling to the self. We don't perceive the self as being that. We perceive it as something that is singular. So what we're saying is the way that we cling, the way that we understand the aggregates, and the way that we understand the self are not in harmony, right? We can't join those two ideas together because they're contradictory, right? They just don't add up to be the same thing. And it's the same thing with the snake and a rope. Their qualities and their essential qualities, they're not harmonious with each other the way that we're clinging to them. Again, since the self is kind of clung to as singular and the aggregates is clung to as something that is multiple, there's a lot of problems that come about with thinking that they're essentially the same thing. Not just that, we also the aggregates themselves are impermanent. They're coming and going. They're always in a constant flux of arising and ceasing, right? We know that the aggregates of last year, say the form aggregates, etc., are not the same thing as they are this year, right? We know that there's been change. But if we were to say that the self and the aggregates are essentially the same, that would contradict the idea that we have of ourselves, right? Because what do we think of ourselves? We think I'm the kind of the same me as when I was born, right? I haven't changed. This idea, this essentially inherent idea of self, this is clung to as something that is permanent, that it sustains, that doesn't change so much over time, right? The me of yesterday is essentially the same thing as the me of today, right? And so again, we have there's this contradiction between the two ways that we cling to the self and the aggregates. So there's a lot of problems that come with that, and so this investigation is meant to disrupt, to harm this idea, or to break apart this idea that both the self and the aggregates can be essentially the same. And so what this does is it creates certainty, right? Once we figure out, okay, it just doesn't make sense for both the self and the aggregates to be essentially the same thing. Once we kind of have that certainty, then that gives rise to the certainty that things that both the self and the aggregates can't be essentially the same. So this is the first meditation.
다 디조 세부 차베쳐도 빼슈바이나 디시 룰당 타바지부디 찌기나스 룰 카르보 임바나시 마레 타바데 카르보 이나 룰데 카르보 인고거레 타바데 타다에나 룰데야 타다 인고거와 진당데다 율니 퉁고거레 가인스나 그 율카가 임바지 진당카가 임바에는 권이 타데이 비다그와 다는 가지고 오직세요와 다 당아주 다디 진용바 갑술라 다디 진에데 가리 증겨르스나 찍 증겨와 다진이 율리 교바 다디 가리 찍래요 얘네야 닥시드 풍부데 가리 두마레와 다 델라베 갑술라 가리 다진기 당페나 진예디 가리 증겨스는 룰 낙보지 진 타바데 가리 차데 것은 타바 까르바 차데 거와 디나신 차데 거래 다 데기 슈스 가리 땡도 타바당 룬예부디 찍마인 바데 용도 와 도드나 아래 진당데당 윤이 퉁거야 말다 퉁거 매바 송산 찍마인 바데 디니 라토 용도 와
So again, to emphasize the point more, come back to this example of the snake and the rope. For example, the rope is itself, it is white, for example, right? Let's just say that the rope is white and the snake is this multicolored, or say has a dark color to it. If the two things are essentially the same, then they have to share those two qualities. But the way that we cling to a snake, a white snake, or a white rope as white, and we apprehend a black snake to be black, these ways of apprehending or perceiving something are not in harmony, right? They contradict each other, right? So, but if they're essentially the same, that can't be the case, right? They have to share these qualities between themselves, right? Same thing. We cling to this idea of self, and what we think of the self is that it's a singular kind of thing. It's just one. It's not many things, this idea of self. But then the aggregates themselves, we can clearly perceive them as being multiple, a collection of things. So the way that we cling to a self, and the way that we cling to an aggregate are contradictory ways of perception. And to think that they're essentially the same breeds a lot of problems, right? So it's the same thing as saying, okay, the snake is black and the rope is white, and then clinging to those two things as being the same, essentially the same. How can that be true, right? So the conclusion is, okay, obviously they're not the same things. They can't be essentially identical, right? So it's the objects of our clinging are not in harmony, right? The objects of what we're clinging to, whether the basis or the object itself, they're contradictory.
풍부기 내당대당 되니 닥진기 되니 진단예부디 퉁게매바 송자 돈다 도도나 다도 진베디 출발해샤 삼베기 삼도실레 보고 와래 대갑소다 베나 파게라 유에샤바딜라 타과 임바칸실라 ngarangi nonni duldu trusha sambata bashirwa dulzindi tulba imbala ngeshike ba nashin chene kasba be gyumzindi jokoene ane dagzindi takpa dan chigbu rama chindu zimbati tulba imba jing ngothena ta ngaju dela to sing gowasil le din do sende nyambarsha rwa din chekom dang jokom ni belma tu stroku gore ta di chig rwa tini da di ngaju 다당 풍부 찍임베게 찍 마임베 곰기다 찌당다고 그래 다디나는 낭세 숨저저래 아니디 아주 상인나게 양 수부당 셈바 소소소소라 자네라 아니 주든 치마들나 깔래깔래한 수기
So the way that for example, the aggregates naturally are, their nature, the reality of the aggregates, and the clinging that we have to a self, they don't line up. They're contradictory. They can't be harmonious with between each other. Right? They contradict each other. And so the effect of recognizing it is you realize, oh, clinging to a self is a mistake. Thinking that there's a self or a me is confusion, right? For example, you think the person that saw the snake in the middle of the road, they say, oh, what I thought was a snake was actually just a rope. I was confused. I thought something was something which it's really not. So we come to the recognition that this self is not something that is completely self-dependent, inherently existent. It just can't be that way. And we come, and when it comes to this idea of it being essentially the same with the aggregates, and so we just recognize that's true. And then the point of meditation is to give rise to have that recognition and to rest within that recognition, and then to take breaks and go off and on and do meditation, going into meditation and coming out of meditation, and going about that in how do you say? In a gradual manner, right? So the thing is that the self and the aggregates cannot be the same thing, right? And so that's the point of the meditation, right? We recognize that we have this certain kind of certainty about that. And this is just the general presentation of what we mean by being free from, by the self as being free from being one, or essentially the same thing as the aggregates. And within that, there are actually three ways of going about applying the mind to this reasoning in more depth. But we'll talk about that in future classes.
Lasso. Chanju simju rimbo je mage banam ge gyure je geba nyambara meba gone gondo pelbara sho